Hello and welcome back to Parallax Scrolling for Web Design. In this video, we're going to get started with our very first project, which is a simple file where we're going to have some text scrolling at one speed and then a background image that's going to be scrolling at a slower speed. Now, our default file here, as you can see, is pretty simple. We have a header and then we have a number of different articles, and we are going to style this a little bit. It's not going to look like this when we're done with it. But we've also applied some default formatting to it using a CSS file called normalize.css, which resets a bunch of the browser defaults and gives us some sensible defaults to start with. You'll notice it takes away the margins at the edges of our document, and it also gives us a sans serif font to work with. And that file can be found on the normalize.css website, which I'll include the URL in the course notes. And on this website, you can actually click on the download link. Now, it's already included in your files, in your project files, so you don't have to download this. But in case you want to update to the latest version, if you're using something more recent than 2.1.1, then you can come to this website and download the latest version if you prefer. And you can download it either by clicking on the link, which will take you to a page where you can copy and paste all of this text into your own CSS file, or the easier way is to simply right-click on the link and click on Save Link As, or other browsers might say Save Target As. But once you have that downloaded, you'll replace the one in your project files folder with this one. Also in our file, we're going to be using jQuery. Again, the jQuery files are included in your project files, but if you want to download the latest version, you can go to jQuery.com/download, and you can find the latest version here. And the one I'm using again is the compressed production version because it takes up less file size and less bandwidth than the uncompressed version, which is easier to read. But we've got the compressed version here, and if we click on that again, it does the same thing as the CSS file. It takes you to a new page where you can copy and paste all the code, or if we go back, we can just right click on that and click on Save Link As, and then save that in the JavaScript folder for your project files. But again, these files are already included with your project files, so the only reason you would want to come here is if you wanted to see if there was a newer version that you wanted to download. But if we go back to our file here, we can see again, it's just some simple HTML that we're going to style. And if we pull our project files onto the stage here, we can see inside the project files folder, you have a folder called Lesson 3 Start, and this is the one we're going to be starting with in the next video. Even though the next video is Lesson 4, we're talking about it in Lesson 3, so I called it Lesson 3 Start. Don't yell at me. So we have our index.html file, which again is the HTML file that we see in our browser right now, and then a few subdirectories. In the CSS folder, we have, like we mentioned, the normalize.css file. In the JS or JavaScript folder, we have jQuery. And then in the images folder, we have grid.gif, which is the background image that we're going to be using. And it's a very small file. It's just a 1 kilobyte file with a little grid in it, and it's going to repeat horizontally and vertically in the background. And again, it's going to be scrolling at a slower speed than our content. So having said that, let's take a quick look at our files here. I'm going to drag over TextMate. TextMate is the text editor I'm using. Obviously, you're welcome to use any simple plain text editor you want. If you've got Dreamweaver, you can use that. Or if you're using Notepad, you can use that. Whatever you prefer. I like TextMate, it works really well. But in TextMate, I want to take a quick look at index.html. So we've got, again, a plain HTML5 document here. And in the head, I want to point out that we've got a link to normalize.css, which is in our CSS directory here. And then another script tag here that's pointing to our jQuery file, which is in our JavaScript or JS folder. So that will help us get started. But there's one very important thing I want to point out in the HTML itself, in the body of the document. Now, normally, if you were going to put some kind of grid background in your HTML, you would either apply it to the body itself, or you would apply it to the container layer that contains all of your content in it. However, we're going to do something different here. Because of the way that we're going to code or alter the location of that grid as we scroll, I'm actually putting that grid in a separate div. And you'll notice that this div here is empty. There's nothing in it. It's just a simple div with an ID of grid and then the closing div tag. So our background image is going to be placed on this div, and then our content div is going to be basically placed on top of that grid div. And again, as we start styling everything and making everything work properly, we'll see a little bit better how that's going to work. But keep in mind again that we're including that grid background in a completely separate div, because the way we're going to animate this is we're going to point to the top CSS property in order to tell that grid where it needs to be located in the browser window. And again, the top CSS property determines where that background image or where that div is located in the browser as far as your vertical arrangement goes. So if you change, for example, the top property to 100, then that will nudge everything in that div down 100 pixels. If you set it to -100, it will nudge it all up 100 pixels. So we're going to be animating that top property in order to get this parallax effect to work appropriately. So that's why we have the div in a separate item, or that's why we have the background in a separate div, I should say. And in the next video, we'll get started coding all of this, or putting our CSS together to make it look a little bit better than it currently does. So we'll get started with that in the next video. Thank you for watching.